Hi and welcome to the Sydney node of the 2019 Computational Law and Blockchain Festival. We're here at the University of Technology in the startup space, and this weekend has been very kindly and generously sponsored by Australian law firm Lander and Rogers. Huge thanks to Rob Neely, partner in corporate, for his welcome yesterday morning, and also to the CEP of Lander and Rogers, Genevieve Collins, for backing this so generously. We really appreciate it. Okay, so my name is Dr. Pip Ryan, and I'm a senior lecturer here at the University of Technology. I'm in the law school, and I'm also a barrister. And in my blockchain world, I am the chair of the Standards Australia Blockchain Technical Committee Smart Contracts Working Group. Internationally, with my colleague Volker Skwarek, we are leading the work for two documents internationally for the international standards for blockchain, which is TC 307. We're in the Smart Contracts Working Group, and Germany convenes that group. So Volker's the rep from Germany for that. He leads a document called the Technical Report, and I'm the lead author of the technical specification. So in the room with us today, we have technologists, lawyers, academics, blockchain enthusiasts, and we also have somebody from the regulator, which is pretty amazing. And we also heard yesterday from a number of others during our festival session. So this symposium falls within what the legal hackers worldwide refer to as the Discuss track. So this event has been coordinated by Codex at Stanford and their legal hackers. They're running their node out of San Francisco. And we just want to say hello to Stephen Nam, Tony Lay, and Roland Vogel. Thank you for your leadership and for organising this. Big hello to the New York group. They're running their festival next weekend, and featuring down there, I'm pretty sure, will be people like Dazza Greenwood from MIT. Hello, Dazza. What we really want to thank, though, is Sydney Legal Hackers. So Sydney Legal Hackers are the reason why we've managed to convene this weekend at ETS, and from Sydney Legal Hackers, we want to thank Graham Groveham, Clinton Chan, and Dom Woolrich. Graham and Dom are here today. Thank you very much. Also just want to give a quick shout out to our note takers. So some of my current students, we have Luana Han, Simona Mulkey, and Taylor Price are going to be assisting with note taking this discussion, and with that we will create a discussion report for publication in the Stanford Journal of Blockchain Law and Policy. We also have lead authors, co-lead authors with me for that document will be Christopher Yong. I'll switch off my mobile phone. I believe that, yeah, that's my husband just telling me he adores me. Thank you. It really is. And also Millicent Watt. So Chris Yong and Millie Watt are actually research team members for the Standards Australia Blockchain Technical Committee, and they are now experts in this area. So it's really great to have their assistance as lead authors on the document that we will be producing, hopefully over the next 10 days or so. Everybody who's with us here today is welcome also to contribute to that document. What you say today will be written down but de-identified. We will then acknowledge that you've contributed if you're comfortable with that, not identifying what you contributed. And then later you can take the document away and contribute your own text, maybe with a bit of scholarship, footnoting, whatever your usual style for professional writing is going to be. So before we actually launch into this, I just wanted to quickly say hello to everybody in New Zealand. It's just been a really, really tough 10 days or so that we've just been sharing across the Tasman. They don't run a node this year, so we just wanted to say hello to everyone in New Zealand who's decided to dial in. I believe it's about 4:30 there. Grab a beer, enjoy. So we have, this year the theme is governance for this particular topic. And I had an idea that what I would like to do is, as well as posing some questions to everybody who's here today, and of course for anybody who's listening to this live streamed version, as well as posing some questions which we've thought through and that we've decided would be a great way to put some structure into today's discussion, which we hope will go for about an hour and 15 minutes. What we would like to also do is suggest 3 different case studies or scenarios that we think might be really useful for us to refer to when we're thinking about governance in certain structures for computational law and blockchain. And what we're going to ask the note takers to do, and I believe they've already divided up this task, is to just give a small description of each of these case studies in the discussion paper. So very briefly, they are the DAO. The DAO and that raising that happened during the creation period of 150 million US, and then what was not a hack, but an exposure or an exploitation of a vulnerability. And the reason I wanted to use the DAO as one of the 3 case studies is not just because Hannah Glass mentioned it yesterday in her presentation during the festival, but also because it is an example of where the governance was supposed to be automated within that blockchain, with the way that it was designed and created and then deployed. But of course, there was intervention by some humans pursuant to some consensus decision-making once that vulnerability had been exposed and the 60 million US was being extracted. So I just thought if anybody wants to talk about that, I thought it might be useful to refer to the DAO. The second one is another blockchain-based scenario, also mentioned yesterday, which was the Quadriga event last year. So in Canada, we have Gerald Cotton, who died on the 9th of December, and he died in India, apparently of Crohn's disease, which he'd had for a number of years. And since then, the 220 million or so worth of various cryptocurrencies, which he had held on his laptop in cold storage, and for which he was the only person who had the keys, both private and public. He was the only person who had access to them. That laptop has since been accessed by Ernst & Young, and there was nothing in there. So this raises a lot of questions about the governance of exchanges. So that's to be distinguished from the kind of self-governance that you would get on a decentralized autonomous organization like a DAO. And I think that's going to be useful for us to discuss today, because we want to talk about how would you govern an exchange if you want to then have best practice and make sure that if somebody who is keeping the private and the public key in cold storage also makes sure that they can be accessed if something untoward should occur. Because death will become all of us, it is inevitable, and it may be that you just happen to have some crypto on you that you would like to either leave to the proper owners or to your family as a bequest or a gift, maybe to a charity. So actually accessing that is important. And then the third one is not blockchain based. This is just a computational law scenario that I thought would be useful, which is a recent series of events in Australia where one of our regulators that manages what's known as Centrelink, which is a central service here for providing disability payments, payments to students who are studying, payments to people who've got care obligations, and also the unemployed. They decided to send out what became known as robo-debt advices. Basically, a series of algorithms were run over some data matching, and it was decided to just automatically send out letters to hundreds of thousands of Australians, letting them know that they now owe the federal government money. And it caused enormous angst to a lot of people, some of whom purely by definition, if you think about it, and under the circumstances were vulnerable, and therefore particularly affected by the fact that they had received some of these quite erroneous letters. Apparently 20% of them were wrong and shouldn't have been sent at all. So that raises the question, well, what about the regulator? How do they govern in a way that also ensures that they're meeting best practice with computational law? So we're talking there about an entire category of accountability for tech and law called the accountability of algorithms or robots. So in order to begin, let's put it out there. So they're the 3 case studies. I thought that would be useful. You're not confined to them. We can discuss any number of examples if it's useful, but I thought if we want to in any way hypothesize about any scenarios, it might be useful to draw on some real situations, and they offer fruit that we can draw upon. So in relation to the discussion document, so that our note takers know where we are, I thought I might go to the section in the discussion document that is known as Part 1, and it's traditional governance models. And I thought it'd be really useful, perhaps to limit this to about 10 minutes, but just to have a discussion within this group where we ask ourselves, quite aside from blockchain and computational systems in our society, how do we perceive traditional governance models? Have they actually been models that we should adopt, models that can be put into computation and into code? And more importantly, are they flawed when we think about how we now run the world on the internet with the platformization of everything? So let's not ask this question in the sense of how should we govern platforms or how should we govern blockchain. What I want to know is how do we currently govern when we talk about boards, individuals, corporates, and regulation? What does that look like? I could kick it off and note that we have from a wonderful contribution from our lead authors, just to start with, and we're just thinking about what governance does. It helps to build trust, transparency, and accountability, and a strong corporate governance practice fosters integrity and stability. So just thinking about those features of good governance, I thought it would be really useful to ask if anybody here would like to kick off a bit of a discussion about current governance models, even in relation to certain operational domains, banking, finance, and I think we've got somebody who's willing to contribute from within the room. Thank you.
I'll start on that just to say corporate governance as a concept has always been sort of a dumping ground for tasks to get done. Some of them are social questions, some of them are legal questions. We've traditionally measured boards on their ability to run a board for running the company. There is now many more broader issues, sometimes referred to as the stakeholder management issues. Some of them are things like tragedies of the common, whether it be environmental considerations, right through to considerations around social inequity or corporate good conduct, even model litigant obligations. And though the government may try and aim to do the best they can in facilitating certain things, there are certain other areas where corporate conduct is going to be more dependent on the corporate conduct by itself. And this has been an ongoing debate in academic literature for at least decades. I'm not sure how far going back. The question then becomes, how do you want to measure corporate governance? And corporate governance can therefore become a measuring tool for everyone to say that there's a problem, we want companies to fix it, we're going to try and add it as an additional thing to measure. That doesn't actually mean that you can do it, because if you have a million different masters, it's very hard to actually have any actual control. So the question that often should be placed with corporate governance as a society more generally is what do you expect from the entities you're governing, whether they be IT-based systems or it be a distributed ledger-based organization, right through to a traditional company such as a bank, or even a more traditional company such as some of the food producers like a farm or anything else. There will be corporate governance systems covering everything from occupational health and safety obligations right through to the legal obligations for cutting edge technology and having things like cybersecurity. The question that should then be asked is, in the planning stage, whether it be for coding or working through corporate structures and setting something up, is what is appropriate for the entity you're dealing with, and how do you manage the social expectations around that to ensure that you're actively contributing to society in line with expectations while simultaneously meeting your legal obligations. As a starting point, that should cover enough for someone else to comment.
I think that's a lot of words to explain what came up in the Royal Commission and what we've been seeing for many years and continue to see. Lack of enforcement. The rules are there, the laws are there. Enough courses at law schools throughout Australia about the philosophy and the lack of regulation, or the philosophy which should underpin the regulation, but enforcement just doesn't take place. We see that time and time again, and we see that in some very obvious high-profile cases. One that I was involved in back in 2003, where it was as a result of exposure via media that ASIC finally decided that it should perhaps take a look at a US $8 billion fund. So we're not talking about a small thing. It was right out there. It had received a lot of publicity overseas, but ASIC for some reason decided it didn't have the time to look at this thing until it became too much of a public issue here that ASIC condescended to consider the matter, and then ultimately closed down the shell company that was here behind the whole thing and fined the person in charge $2,500, reinforcing the fact that Australia is a very good place for money launderers.
So I think that raises some really interesting questions, because what we're talking about is that there are rules and regulations that do exist, and then this issue is raised about whether or not enforcement is happening and whether or not the laws are actually being enforced, in the sense that if you can't trust society to do the right thing, then you need the watchdog to come in and to do its bit. Now, there are a number of ways that this can be done. Obviously, you can bring a private matters when the person, if you've genuinely got victims of a particular kind of corporate failure, then of course they can always bring the action themselves. But one of the problems there is you need to have the funds and the resources. So people often do look to the watchdog. But then, as we heard yesterday during the festival, and as you often hear, the watchdog's job is also, though, to maintain a relatively light touch in relation to innovation and also commerce and business, so that you can keep everything moving along and have activity and confidence that you can do business without it all being overly regulated. So can we just have a little bit of a chat? Does anybody want to say anything about the fact that obviously we do have these laws in place? Does anybody think that that we should be having a stronger hand from the watchdog, or do you think we should always err on the side of just letting things run their natural course so that innovation and also business can do what it does, the business of doing business?
That can only come with experience, sophistication. Now, maybe Singapore is a good example. Maybe it's not the best example because it is also considered a money laundering center. But they somehow have got this balance right between letting business be conducted and regulating the place. I suppose one way in which they do it is when they impose fines that are minimal, and they tend to follow the old British system where you've done wrong and now you will be punished and shamed in the public square. There have been some recent instances where they shut down entire banks, but these are small banks. So perhaps that's the balance. Like it or not, you've got to kill the small fish, some medium-sized fish, and then warn the big fish that if they don't behave, they may suffer a similar fate.
Okay, well then let's pick up on that, and let's go to the second part of the discussion report, which talks about transparency, because a possible solution, if indeed you're right that there's a lot of shenanigans going on and not enough is being picked up by the regulator, big or small fish shenanigans, maybe what we need to think about then is how we make these governance structures more transparent so that consumers can actually see what's going on rather than waiting for the watchdog to step in. So I think we've got a comment either on that, or you can take a step back if you want to and speak to an earlier topic.
So it's tied in, but it's not directly addressing transparency. This is actually the hairy question that is what I call a wicked problem, not meaning evil, but messy human. And we regulate for what is right, what is wrong, what is guidance, but we don't tell you how you do things. And this is a harder question of approach, how you approach things, and it's in everyone's tip of tongues today. It's called culture. How do you regulate for culture? You can't. It's very, very difficult, right? So it's just more of a comment to think about, because everyone's talking about it at board levels, at governance and risk levels, at the Governance Institute's conference. It was actually one of the biggest topics today, this year, and looking at conduct, rather than talking about due process, which I think is what you're talking about. Yeah.
So what are the elements do you think that make up culture? You just mentioned conduct, and how do you do it? What did that conference suggest about where culture begins and how does it permeate?
A friend of mine actually said the hard stuff is hard as it is, but the soft stuff is harder, and that's again how people operate. How you define culture in itself, the stuff that isn't very clear cut in how you operate. It's all the blurry lines, the stuff that is outside of that. It's very, very contextual, and that's where conversations need to happen. So to your point, should we make that explicit, and how should we have a conversation about it? Should we dictate that approach? Even things to enforcement, should it be a soft approach with regulators versus like a hard approach, no nonsense, everything follows to the letter of the law? That comes down to the question also of benevolence as well, and that's the human part that computers really struggle with. I don't think that part can be automated. Yeah.
I think culture is essentially inherently linked with value, and essentially if you look at ASX listed entities and the loose rules and recommendations that the ASX puts out for them, they need to start putting in place values from the top level, which will then, funnel down to the culture all the way through. So I think at a board level, we're talking about traditional systems. So long as the leaders up the top really establish their expectations and their values and make that really transparent with everyone, then all the bottom players should have an understanding of how they should conduct themselves. And by no means does that mean that they will conduct themselves in that way. But if you're saying from the offset, you shouldn't do X, they won't do that, or hopefully they don't do that. Whereas if you don't establish those clear values, then you're kind of treading a grey area, and you're saying, well, we didn't really specify that you shouldn't do it, you should have known not to have done it, and then you start to get into the kerfuffle that we're in right now.
If I could maybe draw on that a little bit too, when you talk about, in some way you're talking about prescribing at some point in law or perhaps potentially policy on what should be governed and how it should be governed, and then harking back to the idea that, you know, should the regulator be jumping into police conduct or something like that. If I could just, I mentioned just a little bit before about perhaps obligations in corporate governance on considering impact on the environment and so forth. There is talk, you know, that boards should be considering the potential impact of their of the company on the environment, and there is talk that that is a consideration that directors are obligated to give. But because it's not flat out prescribed, it seems to me at least that actually having a regulator or a watchdog chase up such an obligation or consideration is potentially asking too much. And that's where, you know, should we just let business run its course? Well, okay, if we do that, then they might not make the considerations that the community is expecting them to make. So when we're thinking about, you know, governments of other platforms or future platforms or platforms in the blockchain or that sort of space, my thought is that, you know, we need to make sure that we're targeting the community expectations that we would like to be governed in the right way. Otherwise, they may get passed over, perhaps inadvertently, perhaps purposefully.
I think what's really interesting is when we're talking about governance, and what's clear that's coming out here is it's not just a case of what are you required to do under law, what are you required to do even under the principles that are set out, which may be legal set by a regulator or within information sheets and all that sort of stuff. It's actually about the organisation itself. Governance is clearly more than just this is what you have to do. And the reason why is because we look at organisations, and I'm not just talking about companies, I'm not just talking about corporate world, it's when we are dealing with some sort of organisation, when we are dealing with even people, and we could say family units, the same thing applies. It's what are you actually doing and what do you expect that person to do? And I think this comes back to the very first point that Pip made, where if we're looking at it, it's about trust, accountability, and actually stability. And if we're looking at it, trust is who are you trusting and what are you trusting them to do? Accountability is to whom are they accountable and what do they have to do to make sure they are, and how do they communicate that? Because then it goes into the fact that if it is going to be stable, is it going to achieve the results, not only that it wants to achieve, but that are expected to be achieved by all of the people who are involved. And this is certainly not just in a corporate environment with shareholders. It goes to the environmental point. It goes to who are the people who actually work within the organisation. It's how do they all interact. And whilst you can say that culture comes from the top down, the same way that you could say the feeling within a family comes from, say, the matriarch or the patriarch of the family, every single person within that organisation, every single person within that family has a role to play. And when we talk about culture, we don't just say what we accept, because what we accept is the standard that we are willing to look past, to look beyond. So, and the idea around going to the decentralized organisation concept, again, it's what do we walk past? What are we able to say, okay, we're not concerned about that? Because that's where the culture is. It's every single person involved, and it's clearly more than just what do we legally have to do. It's what do we want people to do, what do we trust people to do, what do they say they're going to do, and do they actually do that?
I might just add to that this question around the idea, I'm going to take it outside purely financial services or corporate conduct, of the idea of a social contract. Mm-hmm. Corporations exist because they're a legal entity that's created under a society's legal system. We don't actually have to have corporations. We could get rid of them completely if we so chose. This is something that's so entrenched in our society we probably wouldn't, but it is a construct we're used to. If your only model of saying that something's gone wrong, someone has to punish them, subject to resourcing and everything else that will happen across every single legal enforcement body, it raises a big question around the culture in those organisations, because if your only thing is, as Hannah's alluded to and some of the others have alluded to, is that if I trash the environment, say, so badly that I'll get prosecuted, and that's the only factor I'm considering as to whether I dump uranium into a pond or something, it's probably not the criteria you want to be working with. We want to be working in a system where we go, is what we're doing the good thing? And this could go back to a lot of old adages about moral systems and everything else that people need to consider, because you can go down a command and control economy in a society where you have absolute control. A lot of coders would like that because you can have if-then law that makes everything work, until the fact that they discover they can't change anything without legal change, and then realize how hard that is. This is why we use principle-based legislation, and this is an ongoing debate between lawyers and every other body and coders. But I'm finding that this is an area where the industry is starting to mature, and the coders are starting to see the benefit of saying, well, we'll have principle-based things. We might use AI systems to engage with those topics. Now we'll use DLT systems where they're more suited, when there's more practice-based systems, or we'll have systems where it's more facilitation only.
Just on re-transparency, I think the social contract versus the law is a really, really important point, and technology itself has made the world way more transparent. So things you could get away with 10 years ago even, you can't get away with today because you'll be judged in the public court. But within organizations, just thinking about how do you actually bring governance to the surface versus leave it in the boardroom? You know, a lot of organizations have engagement surveys, which are really important, but it's also the lead by example and the human interaction. And if you're a leader in an organization, you know if your culture is good or bad. If you're out there day to day in that human interaction, and it's one of the challenges in the tech world, because you're not going to have the same physical interaction that you can have within an organization. And the second point on transparency is with your clients. You know, with the Royal Commission that just happened, one of the questions I posed on a webinar about the results of the Royal Commission was, did anybody do a client survey? What about actually getting the client's views on what's going on? And had these organizations done that, I think that it would have surfaced a lot earlier. And I think that's some of the obligations that boards should actually have, not just the legal, but it's the social contract.
Except for the NAB ones, because they're dead.
Can I ask Beth something and just leave the camera where it is? Because we had a comment about the environment, for example, as being something that you would consider culturally, even though, and actually under the ASX rules, there are rules now that say you need to be aware of any kind of environmental risk, climate change risk when you're making investing decisions. But it's not so much, are you having a negative impact on the environment? It's could climate change have a negative impact on your business model, and then you might need to advise your shareholders. But the thing I wanted to raise with Beth was, you and I were having a conversation a while ago, and you mentioned this concept called the triple bottom line. And I was just wondering if you wanted to share that with everyone, because I think it's something that does fall to what probably sort of best values.
Yeah, well, basically the triple bottom line is it's not just about the profits, it's about your social contract. And if you want to retain your employees and have a lot of clients that actually value what your organization does, that social contract as a triple bottom line actually has a lot of value to your company.
And the three elements are, so you've got always the economic, because that's the single bottom line that we traditionally used to think about. But the triple has the two other elements, which is environmental and social, isn't it?
Yeah.
So you think about the environmental impact and the social impact. So other point that I wanted to raise, which was, so yesterday during the festival, somebody raised the question with me, surely if your reputation is equivalent to being trusted, and I sort of thought about it later on after the festival and driving home up to the Blue Mountains, thought, what is the difference between reputation and trust? Because at the time I was thinking, I don't think they're the same, but I don't think I was very articulate in the way that I handled it. And I was thinking about it later and tried to imagine, do I know an organisation that has a bad reputation, but we still trust what they do and how they do it? I think we've got a suggestion from the back of the room.
All I was going to say is I think there's many
Well,
institutions we have bad
I think that's
reputations that we trust.
exactly.
Well,
Well,
organisations we trust to do something,
exactly.
we don't actually trust them generally,
Yes.
which is a different concept.
Well, I think that's right. It's great. Everybody's suddenly responding to this because I think it is interesting. Now, the example I wanted to give, and I'm really sorry to throw them under the bus, but that metaphor is perfect for them because it's Uber. The thing with Uber is it's probably the best app of the last sort of 3 years of my personal existence. I adore my Uber app. I have not had a single bad experience in an Uber vehicle. In fact, every one of the experiences has got a little 5-star rating, and now that they've introduced the tips, I've even started tipping the drivers. So the actual experience with the app, the UX, the UI with the drivers and getting where I need to go cheaply and quickly, fantastic. And yet what I don't like about Uber is the culture of its corporate governance. I don't like the fact that they've had all the issues they have. I don't like the issues that arose in relation to data breaches and them not disclosing them back in, I think, July 2017. They've had difficulty replacing their CIO, their CTO, their CEO, because the culture is so fractured. And I think that's an interesting phenomenon, that a brand for a product that exists on a platform could be so strong while its reputation is so weak. And I think this is new. I don't think that's been something we've seen in many organisations or with many products until now. But I think we're going to be scrutinising it more and more. And I was just wondering, does anybody here have anything to say about the fact that your product can continue to make you a lot of money even while the very users of that product have doubts about your governance culture?
I just add a few questions on that.
Yeah, please do. Thank you.
One of the things that comes up with the Uber of models is you could have the product, as you say, but it has certain social credit attached to being a business, as I was mentioning with the social contract, obviously all personal views and whatnot. But in saying this for Uber's case, if there is legislative change around the nature of employment, this is going to be a question. It's not like their customers are going to defend them, because though they might have a very good product for the purposes of use, their fractured culture, to use Pip's words, means that most people would probably side with the drivers in the event that there were substantial protests. If you had protests that were of a very substantial nature all through Europe, like you're already having, you start having in other countries such as we have, such as here, you might find legislative change around the nature of employment, and it's not like it's going to be politically difficult for politicians to side with the employees, because Uber's positioning of itself doesn't do it any favours.
And it's,
I think there's already been some sort of backlash taking that particular example. There are other applications that are that are being created, and they do actually have slightly different employment models for that precise reason. What's interesting though, when we're looking at reputation and trust, and I think Pip touched on this in the very first comment she made, is reputation and trust is in a particular area. And if we go back to the Uber example, we trust them to get us from point A to point B. We trust the driver. We don't trust, and we don't trust the reputation. We don't trust the organisation necessarily to be doing the right thing by that driver. And I don't make any comment, I'm sticking with exactly what people have been saying here, which then means there's a distinction between the trust and the reputation of the person who we interact with, or the application that we interact with, and the corporate entity. And this is also something that people forget, is there are corporations, but that is one level of the interaction that we have. And it's the same idea when we get into these decentralized systems. People forget that what the company's purpose is and what the company actually does is not necessarily directly a result of a decision that is made at the corporate level, at the highest level. Sometimes it is. But a lot of the time, BAU does not go up to the board, does not even go up to the CEO. BAU is something that is the business's general operations. And this goes to the culture point that we were making earlier, which is that if you're looking at culture, you don't necessarily look to the culture of the CEO. You will, however, look to the culture of the people who you're interacting with, the culture in this case of the drivers.
Just thinking, yeah, with the just the product point of view, I've worked in app development for some time, and then when you focus on the consumer, they just want their problem solved, and often most customers are looking just for the shortest path to solve that problem, and probably won't go that far back. It's like consumers looking at maybe fair trade or free range chicken eggs or whatever. Perhaps that niche is growing, and I'm not sure what proportion that is, but I think a lot of people seek to solve their near-term problems, and that's where their consumption will go. And like getting an Uber, great, that product solves my problem, but how far back do they look? And in terms of corporations, it's almost like the reputation is consistent. Like if some might consider it the devil, we know that's just they're looking to appease the shareholders, and that's just what we expect of them. And so we have sort of trust in the consistency of that reputation, even if we disagree with it. So we might know the current investment models and current corporations, they work a certain way, and they might deliver startups in a certain way to give us products that you know, sort of scratch our itch at that instant and solve our problems. But it's almost like, yeah, there's two different levels, and I'm not sure. It would be interesting to know the trend of how far people look back into a product or into a solution and say,
It's got to be growing, hasn't it? I mean, I think as a and it sort of goes directly into the social contract point and community expectation point of view. I think that view when people are considering how an organisation itself is governed and potentially even how a sector or industry or whatever group of organisations are being governed, that they are starting to look, I mean, I think we can see it in the media at least, that they're starting to look a lot more broadly into the adherence to some social responsibility of an organisation.
Perhaps to add, just a quick point on that, just the sort of the ability or for some it might be a luxury to be able to look that far back. Like I know someone who is very ethically minded would always want to be buying free range if they could, but their budget said otherwise. They said, I have to shop at Woolworths getting what I can because of the budget, as much as they were looking to do the right thing. So touching back on robo-debt, like those people might say, look, I don't like how that system worked, but they're just having to address their near-term problems. So it's a level of luxury after that.
Well, I was going to say, actually links into that, which is, I think it also comes down to, whilst I think we are moving in that direction, how much control do you actually have within that situation to impact whatever is going on, rather than how far you can see.
Well, you can move with your financial feet, so to speak. But the point on, I mean, I totally take the point actually on that there are a broad range of people with differing budgetary constraints. But I think that now more than ever, the short-sightedness policy and governance is starting, the impact of that is starting to be more revealed, to the point whereas can we afford not to be considering that broader perspective?
So coming back to your question, you as a consumer love Uber, right? But you don't trust it as an organisation.
It was more its reputation.
Its reputation.
There's a distinction between trust and reputation. I trust them to deliver a great service and platform, but its reputation's pretty crap.
Okay.
At the governance level.
So let's say there was another service just like Uber, which was just as good but had a great reputation. Given a choice, would you choose to use Uber or would you choose to use Uber competitor? Because the service is consistent, so the only variable would be its reputation.
Let's call it nicer.
Nicer.
We've got Uber and then we've got nicer.
Nicer.
I would vote with my feet. I would vote with my feet, and I think that's interesting. And obviously there's this argument, well, if we all do that, then we can influence things. But I think there's something subtle in Millie's point, because her point was, what we need is to be able to influence. I mean, that's what you're saying. You can, and I think technology enables us to be quite subtle and specific about how we influence. I don't necessarily want to vote with my feet and not be the consumer anymore. I would like to communicate with them how I feel in relation to just that element that I would like to see changed. And the technology enables us to do that. For the first time in the history of everything, consumers can influence what happens in the governance level just by giving a feedback rating in relation to that particular thing.
Well, what if in this age, because we're talking about technology is all about like platform and market dominance, and we're talking about, regulators in the US and Europe are talking about antitrust laws and enforcing that. We're talking about market choice here. So what if they had so much market power, you could give them that feedback technologically, but they sort of go, well, you really don't have any choice. And we've seen that in the 1990s as well, where the supermarket chains use their pricing power to put high street mum and pop shops out of business, and then they could use that market power to slowly, gain market share and have adverse effects as a societal benefit, but we don't realise the second or third order effects as individual consumers, and that's where it falls beyond like individual corporate governance. This is more where there might be an externality, and this is where regulators come into play. So I'm curious to hear what your thoughts are.
Two steps on that. One, from a governance perspective, taking this back to the main topic, if we went around everyone in this room, let alone everyone on the video, and asked them what the 10 main things companies should do, you're going to get very, very different answers. A lot of the stuff here, we're talking about consumer-focused things. Most of the directors would actually be sitting there going, what am I doing for shareholders? And if you want to say, well, we have to look after consumers and shareholders, all of a sudden every question is, well, we made a decision for the other group. What if we have to think about other things? There is regulators, by definition, enforce laws that exist within the resources that they have, and will take steps to be aggressive or not, depending on the nature of what they're looking at. And there'll be different things we looked at in different approaches. The question would then become, is there going to be a law to say that we don't want a giant platform that becomes the dominant player? And that's sort of what the United States might be looking at without commenting on other jurisdiction. The challenge comes in when people go, well, what are we actually expecting? This might be more of a social question than a regulator question or even a law question, because you have elected officials going, well, we quite like this entity. And a good example might be if we said we don't like how big Google is, we want to break it up as there is a political question overseas, and all of a sudden you no longer have access to Google. As a consumer, how happy are you?
Can I break up that into two things then? So let's do it step by step. I really love this idea that we've got this discussion about the shareholders as opposed to consumers as your stakeholder of decision-making choice. There's also the bonuses you're going to pay your employees. So there's a third. So this comes down to what are we incentivizing? Where does the reward lie, and what is the business model? So we can discuss that, and I think that has to be discussed in terms of transparency. But what I'd love to do is start moving this now on-chain or into the computational platform. And then going back just one step, and let's do this one first. So first thing I want to discuss, again, putting it onto a platform, is your notion where you say, what happens if they dominate and you really don't have a choice to go and vote with your feet? Or if you do actually say, make the complaint, it falls on deaf ears because they've got so much power in the market. And then you started mentioning antitrust. So just for the purposes of translation in Australia, we call that anti-competitive behaviour rather than antitrust, but we'll use the term antitrust because it sits with the Northern Hemisphere. Let me just bring an example into play. In 2017, Rod Sims, the head of the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission, so this is our antitrust regulator, said, if your algorithm starts to behave in a way that's anti-competitive, you're not going to be able to excuse yourself by saying, my robot ate my homework. You will be responsible. And I want to put that out now to the group to talk about how do we build governance systems into online and automated algorithms, including the data sets we're going to be using, and make sure they're not optimized in such a way that they start offending the very regulations that are supposed to prevent anti-competitive behaviour or oppression of directors and classes of shareholders. I mean, this is a very, very important part of how we should think forwards when we're talking about trying to correct behaviour on platforms. So, did you want to comment on that first of all to kick it off?
Oh, well, just to kick off on that, a very good example at the moment is actually market surveillance, capital markets itself. So MiFID II, now every exchange and every single institution will have to provide the regulator a drop copy, and so basically that's a requirement to provide information to the regulator so they can look through that vast quantities of data. So is that a model that we could propose outside of capital markets and trading to other fields?
Example of people citing the algorithm as an excuse for what happened. There was a case with, I think, 2 German airlines where they had models of algorithms that were competing on price. One of them went bankrupt, the other one's model rocketed the prices up astronomically, I think thousands of %, and they were fined a very large fine, might have been in the billions of dollars, depending on what currency you're listening to when you're hearing this. The fine was based on the fact they basically said, we don't know what's going on, we haven't watched our own system, we just let the AI do the pricing. That's where you have a lack of governance in setting up the algorithm up front. I want to caveat this and split this question a little bit as a subset. There's also times when people just don't plan things particularly well. Having watched some work on recent plane investigations, where they had an algorithm that was helping them fly the plane, and someone somehow had a glitch go that when it was working out the landing definition, it wanted to land the plane at -8 feet. That's not where you want the plane to land. No one programmed that in, it was just a stuff up. So there's going to be things where you need to have systems to monitor that, because none of us want to be on a plane that plans to put itself underground.
But I think what's interesting though is that when talking about systems that do this, really you rely on the human. It's why planes are actually manned by people. It's why if we look at the most recent catastrophe lack of a better turn of phrase, with planes, there has now been uncovered that there were other planes that suffered similar sorts of incidents, where the plane actually wasn't able to stay level. But in one of those, there was actually another pilot on board, and that other person was able to intervene and actually assist to ensure that this plane was able to fly appropriately and land. The technology was doing, unfortunately, to some extent, what it might have been programmed to do. That program didn't give it the right effect, didn't give it the result it was supposed to have. But there was something that didn't quite go right. But the way that we fixed that technology was with a human coming in. And we see this in financial markets all the time, where there are events where we go, this doesn't make sense. The markets aren't working appropriately, and particularly when we have catastrophes. September 11 was a perfect example. Financial markets closed. And they closed because we knew, the humans knew, that if we let the computers run, and even if we let the people who are behind the computers run, that we would end up with a result which was devastating to markets around the world. And by devastating to markets, I don't just mean the people who are the traders, I mean ultimately the banks that they're trading for. I mean the money that is held by the banks, the money that's people's deposits. That's your money. So if we don't have these fail-safe mechanisms, if we don't have an ability for a person to say, this is an event that we have never seen before, this is an event that we need to go back to the people who are involved and solve this, not necessarily relying on technology, you have to be able to do that. And when we're building platforms, they have to be built with this in mind, because we cannot always code for the black swan.
So does that mean we need then to have certain categories of operating domain, and then we decide that depending on the category of domain, you only allow certain levels of automation in the same way that we do for autonomous vehicles? And we should just be doing that. And it's an argument I've been peddling it for a while. But when you think about weapons and you think about markets, smart contracts, autonomous vehicles, algorithms, I think a very important piece of the governance discussion has to be, in what domain are we operating? What's our appetite for risk for the algorithm to fail? And the lower the appetite for the risk of failure, the more human involvement and interference we should allow. And so that's why they have the 6-level autonomous vehicles domain sort of operations. So you have 0 is it doesn't do anything autonomously. 1, the windscreen wipers will come on if it starts to rain, and maybe it'll beep if you start to veer off into the lane to the right. But other than that, not much autonomy. All the way through to you don't even need a driver, no steering wheel, no human, eyes off, hands off. And it's the same with the markets. It's the same with algorithms. If it's just the exchange of money for a $2 download song that you're going to license, not very high risk. Or if it's a smart contract that's got some low-level, low-rate, low-volume Bitcoin transactions, not very high risk. But when you talk about, let's talk about the $600 trillion derivatives market, we probably want to manage that with human involvement. And so isn't that part of the governance for this new world of platformization of everything? Isn't that going to have to be a new discussion we have that we've never had to have before? And I think we've got a response to that.
Absolutely. I think your paradigm, your taxonomy is fantastic. I think there are a couple elements. One is there's something about humans that think automation means it gives you the right answer. And it's a really, really important point when we're talking about technology, because it doesn't. And to Hannah's point, it's programmed by humans. So the question for the computer scientists is, how do you make these algorithms more transparent? And I understand there's a lot of research work going on to surface what is the algorithm actually doing. So I think that's a really important path that needs to be taken, whether it's category 0 PIP or category 5. We need to understand what the algorithms are doing. The second is the skill set required for the future to interpret the data that people are seeing. So as algorithms become more transparent, who's the human that's sitting there monitoring and making the judgment call as to something's incorrect? And I don't even think it has a word yet in the university systems in terms of what that skill set is, but I think we need to develop it because I think it's critical to the future of being able to make judgments, the human interaction of is something going wrong, as opposed to assuming it's right because the computer said it.
I think we shouldn't lose track of the fact that the algorithms automation is put in place by businesses, not necessarily companies, businesses, to save costs, to improve the bottom line, and that is ultimately a decision for managers and a decision by managers and their board. And Rod Sims was absolutely right. If your algorithm fails, you take responsibility. Now, this is not a terribly new argument. To give you one example, ANZ is trying to run this well-known case. I'm not, defaming anyone. Run the argument that it has got no responsibility for a huge money laundering case in Malaysia because although its managers, well, they tried two arguments. On the one hand, yes, they are our managers who manage that bank and oversaw all these transactions. But then at the same time, they say, but they aren't really our managers because they are being seconded. I mean, that's the kind of rubbish argument which you wouldn't accept. So it's the same thing that you're saying with automation. I don't see a huge difference, and just.
Can I add another?
Making
Oh, actually, we've got another comment first because I'm going to take us into a slightly different direction.
Yeah, so
Please do go.
yeah, just on the automation part, this might be sort of a bit of deja vu with when we started simulating mechanical structures. Like people used to do drafting by hand, used to trust technical drawers and engineers to do that. And then we had finite element analysis, we had simulations, we could then very accurately and calculate the sort of optimal size of bolts and whatnot. But it still had the human check in it, and I think it still does to this day, even though we might simulate something like model it up, run it in simulations, run vibration analysis. We sort of should be catching more things, but I don't know if we question the algorithms as much because they were down at that engineering level that people don't necessarily see. Maybe when we saw the bridge suffer from resonance, that was probably before that, it was kind of analyses, that was sort of like a black swan event. The bridge was designed for a certain weight and load and on a rainy day, but maybe not that specific wind velocity that generated the resonance of the bridge that made it catastrophically fail. So when we see them, then we can add them to the list of things to check, and having the tools like finite element analysis and simulations allow us to do more. So I'm not sure if we question those and like those algorithms have benefited us, but we didn't question them as much. Nowadays, in these kind of algorithms for piloting of vehicles, maybe that's a bit different, but I'm not sure how different a bridge might be to an aeroplane in some respects.
Airbus ultimately intended that the plane should be able to fly themselves and you have no pilot. That's the ultimate goal. But as we can see, this is a personal thing, and it may not be the best example given the recent 737 crash, the recent Boeing crash. But I personally don't like flying Airbus because when the damn plane flies, it rocks and shifts like a Boeing does not. And discussions with pilots about it, and they say, well, the problem is Airbus flies by wire.
Thinking about this question of accounting to shareholders, customers, or your employees, and a lot of people said after the global financial crisis that one of the problems was it was incentivized. The behaviour on those credit default swaps and these subprime mortgages was heavily incentivized, and it fed itself. So you do want to satisfy the shareholders. Very few people were thinking about the customers. In fact, they were really treated as the sort of the victims in the end, but also feed fodder. But it was incentivized by delivering these amazing bonuses. I think we're at a time post that GFC where for the first time in history, we have a global community that's asking questions about this. And as we move towards automation, I think we're going to hold the technology to an even higher standard of accountability, which we generally do. I think humans hold technology to a higher standard than we do ourselves. If a self-driving car kills someone, we're all up in arms, and yet we know there's going to be about 200 deaths a week worldwide at the hands of humans driving vehicles. But we're all still talking about the one death in Phoenix last year because it was a self-driving vehicle. So I just want to move the conversation onto platforms and ask ourselves, is that something we're now going to expect from governance models? That there's going to be transparency about why you're making the decisions you're making at that level in a way that we have never done before, because it's not just that we want to know whose interests you've got most at heart, but we know we're going to be leaving it to a technology to then automate the processes. So is that something that we see as a trend and something that's going to be part of this new governance regime for the platformization of services and products?
Maybe before somebody answers that, I wonder if we're all still talking about the incident with the self-driving car is because we wonder whose fault it is. And we love attributing fault to people and accidents. And when we're talking about things like decentralised autonomous organisations where there isn't a entity with legal personhood that can be blamed for, well, in the normal course of things, and I guess that's an evolving topic, but because there is less of a person to blame and attribute and perhaps recover from, is that why we're still talking about those things?
Going back to cars, once it might be an accident, but if a director knew there was a high level of risk that it would happen again, but chose not to share that, then it moves into malicious intent then, because it could hurt others. And it's the same thing with the asbestos case, the Jane Tardy case, which I think everyone in Australia is fairly familiar with. So I'd like to bring up something called the just culture process. It's something they actually use for ER and triage of if you only had one medical resource, but you had two patients, how do you choose which one you save, you know? And it's the classic trolley question that they're posing in a modern day Uber world, like self-driving vehicles. You know, if there were two different, you know, a child and an old person, who would it choose to kill? The passenger, for example. And those are very, very messy questions, but the just culture process goes from a range of, you know, was it something that was like an error in the code that can be fixed and we correct it, that we didn't know before, ranging to reckless all the way through to it's actually sabotage. So rather than talk about algorithms being good or bad and making a very binary sort of situation where we have to regulate it or not regulate or who the parent is, we have to recognise we can't know how the algorithm will always work because we are moving from a heuristic type of algorithm, if this then that, to black box algorithms which are treated as proprietary information that we may not be able to have access to. So the Google black box algorithms are an example of that. To a third class of algorithms now where we actually don't know how to arrive to that answer because there's new techniques like deep learning, reinforcement learning, and beyond. So our job isn't to work out how it works. I think our job is to work out what was the intent of that algorithm. So the same algorithm as a virus that is designed to create a cybersecurity attack, it's a very clear case of malicious versus an error, which could be an airline code that could have been corrected, you know, and that is a genuine error. But if it was not corrected and a director knew about it and it caused others to also die, then it moves into a different intent. So, yeah.
So I love that discussion and I want to stay on this now for a while because it's incredibly valuable, but let's not forget the word that Hannah loves so much, which is expectation. So the intent of the algorithm is what is it actually programmed to do? What is it supposed to do? But then in the world in which Hannah operates, international banking, she's always going to be asking, well, what's the expectation of the consumer? Because that's just as important as the intent. Whatever you say you think it's going to do is why people would engage with it. Just let's go with it, because I love the idea that you've now decided we're not going to ask these questions in a binary way. We're going to break it down into something much more nuanced and ask ourselves, what are the different levels? And I loved the taxonomy that you just gave us, which was, it could be just an error in the code. You could have all the way through to, you could have recklessness, negligence, sabotage. You need to know where it sits on there. So yeah, we had a few people wanting to speak and let's go with it. I think we're going to go to, misexpectation.
I think this concept of expectation is fundamental to what we're doing, because when we're looking at algorithms, it's not we expect the algorithm to do this. It's going back to what you were saying before. It's what does the consumer expect to be the outcome? The consumer shouldn't care what the algorithm is, what the data is. They just expect that if they get into a car and the car has autonomous windscreen wipers, that the windscreen wipers will work as expected. It also is the case that if a consumer gets into a car and they're driving the car, and that it is supposed to have a degree of autonomy when it's actually driving, that there are certain times when they can just sort of sit back and don't really need to concentrate and they don't have to have their hands on the steering wheel. The consumer is not trusting that the algorithm is right. They are trusting that every aspect of it, the expectation of it, and they're not just saying the person who coded it, they're also saying the company that sold you the car, the person who sold you the car possibly, that all of these together create the expectation that this should work. Part of that expectation could be that, well, I've spent a certain amount of money on this particular vehicle and therefore I expect to get that service. Whereas if you spend a lower amount, there's almost an expectation of, yes, it tells me it operates at this particular level, but I won't necessarily trust that. And it goes to not just what you were sold and what you were told was in the algorithm, it's all of the surrounding circumstances that gave you that expectation. And that's something that we need to take into account. On the point of algorithms, which is slightly different, but I think we need to think about algorithms not just being as this is what it's supposed to do, but looking at the data underneath that. And the reason why that's important is because our expectation is that the person who created the data is right. But the expectation is that that data is the right data to use. And when we're looking at a lot of these autonomous situations, particularly using AI, we've found that when they're led to run, we may end up with a result we never even thought was right, because they're taking account of information which we didn't even realize was in existence. And information which humans know is not what the result should be, but because there's been a pattern of behavior over time that leads us to a particular result, then that AI will spit out the result. And that result is not what we want it to be. It's not, going back to expectation, it's not what we expect. And it's not a problem with the algorithm. The algorithm is doing exactly what it's supposed to do.
It's sort of the Centrelink issue is a very good example, because they thought, well, we'll data match with everybody's ATO, so this is the tax office records, and then we'll get all the data matching in their bank records. And Australia's got a very inclusive banking system, and the government basically says, if you want certain government benefits, you're going to have to give us your tax file number. And it's very clever, because it means all these agencies can then do the data matching. But that's what you're talking about. We're talking about an algorithm that was perfectly proper and had the right intent, but the problem was that it took that information and then did certain things in a way that were unexpected and came to negative, unexpected outcomes.
In addition to the data point, there's also training the algorithm. So there's an input into the algorithm, which is another variable that we haven't had to wrestle with. So you have humans that are actually training these algorithms. And one of the complexities is, how do you know once you've trained an algorithm, is it the data that's causing the problem? Is it the training set that's causing the problem? Is it the algorithm? And so I think one of the discussions needs to be around the complexity of the online world and how do you dissect that? And again, back to your point, Pip, the transparency of it all.
Yes.
But just to pick up on what Anna was saying, ultimately it comes down to buy and sell. If I get $100 to buy something from you, I want to know that what I bought from you is what you say it is.
Exactly.
It's as if this algorithm has become the 21st or 22nd century version of the disclaimer. Yes, I sold it to you, but it's the algorithm took care of that, and I don't want to know about that. Given
And I love that, because this is a computational law festival. We are trying to dig into the law, and I love the idea that we do all of this and then we find out actually there was a disclaimer that said I'm not going to be responsible if the algorithm misbehaves. Now, sometimes in certain statutory regimes, that's not going to wash.
Exactly the point.
The whole room has just blown up.
But I think that that's exactly why we have those statutory regimes, because people expect that when you're buying something from someone, from a particular organisation, that it has gone through certain checks, that it'll do what it's supposed to do, that it will not harm you in some way. And you can have these disclaimers that say, all care, no responsibility, we've kind of done our best efforts to make sure that this works. If it doesn't, we're sorry, but that's it. you have, and this is why we have the statute set coming in over the top. It's because if we were just acting on a purely contractual basis, if it was purely the case of what we're operating for profit, then that makes sense. But it goes to the social contract that we were talking about, and where the social contract has been eroded, that's where statute comes in over the top and makes sure that you have to enforce that social contract. But what's really interesting now is if you look at what happens from the perspective of the share price, when something does go wrong with something that has been produced by a company, frequently the share price will go down and the cynic will say it's gone down because they've had to have a recall and so it's going to cost them more money. But we're also seeing that the share price goes down because they didn't do what they were supposed to do. They didn't fulfill that responsibility. Because whilst we have the statutory obligation, that social contract is coming in, and we need both. Because unfortunately, the social contract probably isn't enough in and of itself, but having that statutory obligation reinforces what your responsibility should be.
I just also add, there's a broader step across the whole discussion we just had. We regulate systems often. We don't just regulate an outcome. We do regulate outcomes in certain contexts, but it's often the system. So if you're setting something up correctly, whether it's building a house or building an AI system, if the inputs are bad, and most of the systems come down to two things: inputs being bad, so data and AI systems. In a house, the actual inputs in terms of the quality of materials, or the governance setting it up. Because if you have poor systems supervising it, whether you're building a floor badly without enough beams to support it, or you're building an AI system which doesn't have adequate controls, you're still going to have people fall through the gaps, and it's not a good outcome. And like any of the DLT systems, you can build something, but it's then locked in. This is part of the problem for coders, that they want to have systems where you have adequate governance. This means you have to slow down, think about it, and work through all the problems you may have up front. And this is part of the obligations of having a governance system. That's why you have questions of coders' liability, just like if you had someone building the floor in the analogy I just gave, who didn't set up the floor correctly without the adequate support, it fails. It's the same sort of system. We have those systems in our society. We need to work through applying them to this technological evolution. And I'm also going to add that you need to have adequate resources to plan and adequate resources to set them up. You can't just go, I'm going to build this in a garage and hope that we can build some massive system. It doesn't always work. No individual is going to always be able to think through everything. And as a side note, which goes to that expectation problem we had before I throw to Sharon, because you've had your hand up like me for ages, expectations can often be very unrealistic. So you have to be mindful as a human. And one example I'll give from a personal experience, having a vintage car with a chrome front, people with reverse radars can't always see my car. So I have had the grills broken twice. These are hideously expensive to replace, and they blame the car because it doesn't show up on radar, because they're not looking. And that's not an acceptable way. I'm reversing my car, waiting for the beeps, and it just doesn't come up because of the chrome and the way that this particular car is set up. This is a challenge that people need to work through, because you can't just go, I'm going to rely on the system, I'm not looking, I'm driving backwards. And this was seen, I believe, in Google testing, that they filmed a pile of people driving, a lot of people doing things like sleeping. And that's why there is this need to go, well, if we're going to have AI, or we're going to have autonomous vehicles, we may as well go the whole hog. It's not because of the systems need to be developed, it's because there are lazy people who rely on them too heavily and have completely unrealistic expectations of what the computer can do.
It's beautiful, because it brings me, I just like to say, Jonathan, that's beautiful, because there's something called the fence paradox, right? Where the fence paradox, where you put a fence on the edge of a cliff, it gives this false sense of security. And so the crowd comes and it leans on it until the fence breaks over. As opposed to if you have no fence, it's like, buy, beware, caveat emptor, approach with a degree of caution and beware. And so there's a beautiful case of, I think they were experimenting a small town in Germany where they lifted all road traffic lights, and the cars had to basically navigate and be hyper aware of, being aware of everyone else, as opposed to driving, in autopilot mode. So to Jonathan, your example, I'd love to, I'll dig that up for you actually. But this actually comes back to the question of, there is a baseline requirement in order to operate in different areas. And it comes down to a degree of risk and assessing that risk. So for example, launching an app where someone manages a schedule, very low risk potentially to the consumer, but ranging all the way to very high risk. I go back to examples like healthcare, airlines, because they
they're about souls on board. They're about people dying. And the most classic example that everyone's thinking about this year is called Thrums, right? So let me take it back to something a little bit more local. You talk about regulating systems and wanting and having an expectation of outcomes. In New South Wales, my understanding is we have the building codes. Now, they're not rules, they're codes of conduct, sort of codes of how buildings should be built. But every site is so different. So you actually need someone to sign off on it, right? A professional, so a consulting engineer who will wear that professional liability and say the building will stand. But we have a case of the Opal Tower where there's a fracture in the actual the structure of it, and so we don't know what will happen. So there's this discussion now of should the industry self-regulate, because you do have conflicts between who pays you to sign off on it, which is the developer, and they have that professional indemnity, and you know it's a very small industry and get to that sort of level. It's the same blueprint in banking as well and a few others. But we cannot put hard and fast rules around it because every site is different and the inputs are very different and the context is very different. And the year the building was built was very different. So building codes, you know, that apply to one building at one generation will look very different to an Australian Federation house, for example. You know. So that's where it's very messy in governance.
I'll also add just not done properly for about 10 years though, it's slightly all information, that there were a lot of challenges around the idea of privatising effectively the governance, which is sort of what you're alluding to. Do you want a government body that comes in and does it? Do you want some sort of hybrid? Or do you want a private institution which could be potentially, in what you call in the government context, a regulatory capture, in that case I guess a sign-off capture environment where there's only a small number of developers, there's only a small number of surveyors or assessors who can need to be paying their own bills, going to exams before our budgets. So that's something to think about in terms of those sign-off processes. But then you also have to think about, do you want a government body to sign off on all your things?
Yeah.
So then, to that point, is it actually analysing the market structure of that particular industry? Is that actually, taking a step back, the correct question we should be asking when it comes to governance? Yes.
You'd have to really, I mean, that's a really interesting example that you give actually about the certification and codes for building, because you need to look back at exactly how this private certification regime came into being, and at some level it came into being partly because of what you say is, if do you want the government to sign off on everything, but partly as well because people wanted faster and cheaper solutions. And just going back to the whole, how far are people looking back into something, then yeah, it might have been a faster and cheaper solution. Has it given us the best result? It's a good question. It's a really interesting topic.
So it's about the models of governance, and for example, you said, do we want the government to sign off on it? For example, we've got the Access and Assistance Bill right now, and it comes down to competency of, do they understand cybersecurity enough to actually create these laws and understand its impact? Have they consulted the right people? You know, who should actually be technologists, should actually be more representative of society across sections. So it's more the model in which we operate, and it may look very different.
Underneath that is a trust in the competence people who are involved in that environment, which is just a side comment, but an interesting point we'll continue to discuss.
In relation to the Access and Assistance Bill, there's two interesting things that come out of it. One is there's the access and assistance. So this is a bill that was introduced last year, 8th of December. We had half of the Parliament saying don't do it, and for some reason on the 9th of December they all went with it anyway. By the way, the same day Gerald Cotton died in India. Don't know if it's related. Let's not go there. There is a part of it where the access or the assistance that the telecommunications or platform services provider has to give up the encrypted correspondence with the alleged criminal. We're talking money laundering and counter-terrorism or terrorism financing. That's what we're trying to address with this bill. And it's now actually an act, it's been enacted. And the idea is that the government, there's 5 government agencies, we're talking spy agencies in Australia, ASIO, probably the Federal Police, will be able to go and ask the platform provider or the telecommunication services provider to decrypt the correspondence that they have on their system, because one of the parties to the correspondence is apparently a suspect. Now, there's two problems. Number one is there is a whole part of this legislation that's voluntary. And the Bar Association and the Law Council of Australia has a lot of issues with this, because we're nervous that when you issue somebody with a notice and you say, "Hi, I'm from the Australian Federal Police, we've got a little bit of a request here for you to assist us, please," how voluntary does that feel? And how long can you hold that person and detain them for voluntarily before they start to feel as though they're actually being detained? And then the second question is, what if the other party to the correspondence is actually their lawyer, and the correspondence is subject to legal professional privilege? And this isn't new, it's arisen with wiretapping as well, where you find evidence in court is being tendered and actually it's subject to a privilege that's owned by the client. Yes, there may be a suspect, but I do believe this is one of the foundations of our justice system, that you are entitled to confer with your lawyer. So these things are very important, and I think it sort of takes us to a conversation that we could also include as we're thinking about where we are with this discussion in this symposium, which is the automation of these things that impact upon our legal rights and on legal service delivery. And then the second question that might be interesting for us to think about is, how much of blockchain and the automation of trust can we use to solve some of these problems? And I don't think we're there yet with blockchain, but I think it's on the horizon to be able to put some verification and authentication processes using sophisticated cryptographic proofs. And do we then lose that if we have a government that can demand you decrypt it? And can it be decrypted? So these are really, really interesting points where we are now in the beginning of 2019, and I'm happy to open up those sort of issues for further discussion.
It's an interesting question, given that we live now in, well, I worked for many years with open source data. I love open source data. And time again, I find persons whom I had to deal with for one reason or another come back with what seems like a silly question: how did you find that out? Does it work? Because you put it there. And that's where you see.
That's how Silk Road came undone. Bake your email into the code and they will find you.
And you'll find it. I mean, so in a sense, it would appear to me that there's already a degree of transparency, and that's probably a good thing. Let's just compare that to how banking regulation used to be, might still well be in this day, but back in the early 20th century, when it was said that if the Bank of England thought you had done something only slightly wrong, you got invited in for tea and biscuits, and if they felt that you had done something very bad, then you got invited in for just tea with no biscuits. But the public never knew about that. And you got to this ridiculous position where central banks would issue their annual reports and speak of regulatory action taken, but never mention the bank, and then for you to try and guess which incident this was. It looks like it was this bank, but no names were ever mentioned. That I think contributed to the lack of the position that we are in now. So.
Yeah, which is lack of oversight, governance, transparency. I think, was there a comment here in relation to the way that the law is being impacted by this and delivery of legal services, or the impact on our rights?
Yeah, not quite to that. I was touching a little bit on a point before, just like almost back to the examples of the tools sort of helping us do things, and then like the fence example, where like a recurring theme that I've looked at is just where we sort of lose our experience and lose our judgment or ability to take the time to learn those things. So once there's a barrier there, we don't need to invest the time anymore. It's very convenient for us to approach the edge without trying. But then, yeah, if the fence is not there, we need a bit more time to learn that skill. And that's, yeah, perhaps not, yeah, just needing the time to learn that. But then going towards sort of who is able to, A, have the time, and B, perhaps have the mindset to appreciate the tools. So if we then go towards blockchain, it's like, well, who do we sort of entrust to be doing that and having the time to do that, and to make sure that, yeah, people aren't getting too relaxed about using the tools without actually looking under the hood. And for those who can't look under the hood, what confidence do they have in a system that says there is someone with the skills and time to look under the hood?
And I think what's really interesting, going back to Pip's original point, which is to do with rights and legal rights, if you're creating one of these systems, you need to actually think about what are the legal obligations that underpin it. So, for instance, if you're creating a system for lawyers, how do you deal with privilege? How do you make sure that you can actually enforce the rights, the fundamental obligation that a lawyer has to their client, the fundamental privilege that a client has, that correspondence with their lawyer, which is legal advice, will not and cannot be tendered in court. This is one of the bases of our legal system. But even if you're not just looking at lawyers and their obligations, if you're thinking about bankers, they have a duty of confidentiality to their clients. Again, that is a duty that is owed, and perhaps this is one of the circumstances where legislation and governments may be able to intervene. But still, if you're building a system, which is for bankers and their clients, it has to be able to give effect to that. So whilst we have a degree of transparency, that transparency cannot interfere with those legal rights because they are fundamental to the way that we will interact as people. They're fundamental to the obligations that we have within that relationship. And so you can have transparency, and yes, it improves what you're doing from a technological perspective. It does mean that, yes, you can potentially identify people and identify problems. But there are circumstances where you do not want transparency, where you have obligations to not have transparency.
That's right, and not to disclose to third parties except as required by law, but then certain things, you could say, well, we're not going to make it transparent, but you actually may have to make it discoverable. Yes. And you go back to I think it was the Google black box that you were talking about. You know, if you're going to make the code completely transparent, or the data set you're using, I think you may need to make it discoverable. And if you then can't discover what it was, which I think is a point that Beth was making, if you can't work that out, you really should ask yourself whether you should be using it.
Yes. Just on that point, Pip, the difference between the programmable age and the cognitive age is very distinctive. The programmable age, which we've just been through, is the ability to program known things. And so you can unwind it to your point on regulating systems. I know how a building's built, and you can unwind that. In the cognitive age, it's much, much more difficult. And there are millions of permutations that these systems combined with data, combined with training, produce. So there's this question, I think it's a legal issue on reasonableness and expectation of the quality checking that happens when you build these systems. And there's a cost equation that runs with the actual cost to quality check a system. And I think it will end up being decided in law through cases where things go wrong of what's reasonable in terms of the testing of these systems.
Yeah, well, it's really interesting you raise the point of being reasonable, because that is fundamentally what this comes down to. And I keep on using this term expectation, but expectation is, what do we believe is reasonable?
Yeah.
And that's
it
something.
Changes.
Yeah, and it's what courts have been trying to determine for centuries. And it evolves through time, through technologies, and it has to. And that's, again, it's that fundamental underpinning of what needs to be taken into account. And it may be the case that we're not quite sure who is responsible, but we certainly know what it should be. And once we know what it should be, we may be able to go back and say, well, was this the person who was offering this? Was this the actual person who developed it? Was this a combination of those people? Was it that the company should have known that you can't implement a black box solution for this particular thing? That they should have known that that information should have been discoverable? Was it that they should have known and that it was reasonable to expect that even though it was a cognitive process, it wasn't just simply programmable, that in implementing a cognitive process, we needed a fail-safe?
So a great example is in litigation, using artificial intelligence like predictive coding to decide whether a document is discoverable or not. And anybody who's been in that space, it's a really interesting point on who is ultimately responsible. So while these systems do two things, one is they reduce the amount of time that you have to spend to find the relevant documents. So therefore the cost is less. But what if they miss a document? So then is the law firm liable because...
Or accidentally produce one that's privileged.
Exactly. So when you're implementing a system like that, when does the human element, how far do you go in terms of quality assurance? And do you need to review every single document?
So it's
a threshold.
Yeah, there's some mechanisms that have been introduced. The United States has introduced some clawback agreements and arrangements that you enter into, and I think that's a good example. So clawback is You pre-agree before the discovery that if you inadvertently produce a document that's privileged, you get to claw it back, and everybody has to pretend they didn't see it. And you can do that. Lawyers are actually quite deft at pretending that they do or don't know certain things, and it's quite a skill, but it's important. Judges do it all the time. But I think it's very interesting to think that we may live in a world in the future in which we will take these technologies and take advantage of the opportunity to pre-think what we think is reasonable and maybe program that into computational systems.
Okay.
And then what you would do is you would have parameters of tolerance, and you could then say, well, we will automate the repayment of certain amounts based on the fact that a breach has occurred, but let's all continue anyway, and that could satisfy any potential dispute.
Yeah, but I think also when we're looking at prepayment and we're looking at what do we think is reasonable, that also needs to be able to change over time. Because what is reasonable today may very well not be reasonable in 5 years' time. And going back to your point about pre-agreeing what you need to do when you accidentally disclose something you shouldn't have, the fact that you need to pre-agree shows how far we've moved, because previously lawyers actually just had that as one of your, not necessarily your underlying professional obligations, but it was your duties, and your relationship as a member of the legal profession was such that you sort of knew that if there was something that you received that you knew fundamentally you should not have received, and that can change what actually happens, you probably would just call up the other side and say, I didn't receive this, it's been deleted. And you don't do anything else, you don't comment on it, just say, I did not receive it, it has been deleted, and that's it. The fact that we've now moved to a state that you need to agree that shows that there's been a change in the fundamental nature of how we operate. And I'm not saying this is always required or always the case that this sort of agreement does enter, as actually entered into. But it shows that we move along and things change over time, and we have to be able to ensure that whatever we've coded as being reasonable, whatever monetary threshold we think is reasonable, because $10,000 today will not be the same as $10,000 in 10 years' time. We have to make sure the system's able to be updated.
I think we need to take a step back here and look at community expectations. I mean, the legal profession does work within the community.
We try to.
Well, you've got no choice, and open source data is making that more difficult. So speak on from not going into too much detail from both sides of the fence within the legal profession and outside it. While lawyers may have these rules as to what they want disclosed and what they don't want disclosed, open source data has determined otherwise. There's a lot out there which your clients can access. So while the two lawyers may have decided that, yes, this will not be discoverable or that will not be discoverable, the client can go away and find it out and then hold it up to you and say, why didn't you get this for me? And it's, not going to be of much good to say, we had decided it's not discoverable.
Yeah, but we're not the mouthpieces of our clients.
Well,
our obligations are to the court first, and then to the clients.
And that's where there will be confidence in whether we like it or not, in the legal system is going to be eroded.
That's legal services as opposed to justice. The justice system is upheld when we behave the way we're supposed to, even though as a service delivery model it may seem less than adequate, and it can be frustrating, very frustrating for clients.
It's frustrating.
Yeah, I know. But it is actually as fundamental to the justice system. So Sharon, you've got something for...
Can I introduce a question, unless you wanted to introduce something else?
No,
just following a question from this.
We're winding to maybe moving towards a final question.
Say 10 minutes, probably.
Let's do 10 more. Yes, 10 more minutes.
So this comes to the question of now crossing borders, because technology can overcome borders, and this actually challenges each regime right around the world. And we're seeing this because there were a lot of international submissions going back to the Act now, but then bill, that other regimes are inheriting our laws, through no choice of their own. And that comes down to, again, we talk about expectations, so let's talk about privacy. I recently heard a talk by Professor Carlo Ratti, who's the director of the MIT Sensible Cities Lab, and he is trying to solve for infrastructure where you have to spend, a tremendous amount of money because you're planning for the next 30 years of our roads, for example. And what will that look like now that we may have driverless vehicles? And does it increase congestion? Does it decrease it? Should we put 3 more lanes? Should we actually reduce it and add, cyclist paths? So these are messy questions. And he said, well, how do we make decisions? We need data. And he said, from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, it's very interesting to see in regimes where there have been a lot of state expectation of we over the I, you know, asking for data off your mobile phone, how you move, it's almost like no questions from the citizens, right? As opposed to here, where it's more the I than the we. He says it's really hard to get people to opt in to give their data, so you have to move up the value chain and give them something like free Wi-Fi so they can monitor, you know, how they move around our cities. And he said, you know, it's so interesting to see from a privacy perspective the community expectation and how they differ from regime to regime. So this comes to, sure, if you choose to travel to regimes like China, you are, you know, making the conscious decision to opt into the fact that you will be surveilled, you know, from a state perspective. But, you know, what happens when you inherit the platform regimes of a big tech giant that sit outside of, you know, our jurisdiction and you have no reach, you know? So just putting it out there.
That's a great question. That's a great topic. I love the idea that we've now landed on privacy for this final 10 minutes, and you have posed a wonderful question, which is about you've got two levels to this. First of all, you introduce privacy and data protection and our personal data and our treatment and our attitude towards it, but you've also said we're going global. And we've got all these different jurisdictions. And I really would love to hear from everybody, but I'll just say as a starting position, I'm noticing more and more the globalization of certain laws. So I just see everybody has now decided to adopt the GDPR because it's the toughest. And if you adopt the GDPR, well, by default, you'll also get that subset known as the Australian privacy laws, which are tiny compared to the reach of the GDPR. And why do we do that? Because we want to actually do business with Europeans. And we want to have customers who are Europeans. So this is really important. I think banking law is very much dominated, if you want to play with them, by the US. And I think that's going to happen more and more over the next 20 or 30 years because it's simpler when we're creating global systems. So that's just a comment and a layer on top of this initial idea. And I think you'll find, Graham, there's a couple of takers for conversation immediately behind you on this.
Observations, because you're balancing the strongest model versus the race to the bottom as a regulatory regime. So there will be some people who go to the weakest regulatory regime for privacy. Others will go to the safest or the strongest one because it gives them that brand or reputational confidence with their consumers. Other points I was going to add is, as mentioned yesterday when I was speaking, there's a lot of international coordination between regulators. We do have different jurisdictions, and where regulators are coordinating often is to try and facilitate the overlaps where we can. The regulatory regimes, and I'm talking about across all legal regimes, not just the ones I work with, are going to have some nuanced changes. Some of them will be cultural changes, some of them will be other factors, which might be geographic or financial or whatever other factors. But where possible, the different regulators do integrate and work internationally and coordinate a lot more than people realise, but it's just not something that's made obvious. And I would assume, without knowing complete detail, that Treasury functions and the government bodies will have similar engagement. So these are just some of the factors to think about. I'm not going to go into the privacy side as much, even though it is a very important topic, other than to observe that, as you've alluded to, as we engage more and more internationally, people are often signing up for things in other jurisdictions without even realizing that they're effectively contracting into, say, a US system or a European system. Or you might get a system that says, if you're in Europe, you're getting this nice set of terms and conditions. If you're in, say, the United States or one of the North American countries, you get this middle range of competition laws or middle range of laws. And then if you're in these other countries where we think we can get away with it, which goes all the way back to the original question of corporate governance and setting appropriate systems to meet consumer expectations, not just what we can get away with, is you might have this bottom rung legal minimum thing saying basically you signed up, bad luck, you gave us everything including your firstborn child.
I think Pip, you raise a really interesting point, as do you, Sharon, when we're talking about privacy. First of all, privacy in Australia is about personally identifiable information. That's information about you. But when we're thinking about privacy, we're actually going towards confidentiality. What information should the rest of the world have access to? And that's not just my name, my date of birth, my health record, my bank account details. It's actually, as you say, where have I been during the day? What have I been doing? You can very easily de-identify that, but it doesn't mean to say that everyone should have access to it. Ironically, we actually give away that data quite frequently through things like certain platforms we interact with on social media. And sometimes we give it away because there was something which is a really cool test that tells you which rock star would you have been in the 1980s. And you don't realize when you did this questionnaire that to find out which rock star you would have been, that you're actually giving away your location data. So getting people to give you that information is actually not as difficult as you might think, but it's what you do with that and what you're allowed to do with that, which ultimately we're coming over the top with. And GDPR is quite interesting because part of the reason why it's being implemented in various different places around the world is because it has this extraterritoriality. And by that I mean it applies to anyone who is European, regardless of where they are. And because of that, if you're an organisation elsewhere in the world, say Australia, you're trying to implement measures which are likely to comply with it, because you know that it is likely that there will be someone who wants to use your services who is from somewhere in Europe. And so you have to. You also, it doesn't mean to say you don't have to comply with the Australian requirements too, but it means you have two obligations. And so we are getting to some extent this internationalization of certain regimes because we have to, not because the government says that you have to, your government of where you're domiciled, but because it goes to the people and it goes to your obligations as a company, as an entity, working with those people.
As you said about community expectations before, we are part of a global community now. And I think more and more people are realizing that, expecting that companies kind of hit that highest threshold in terms of whether it's about privacy data and complying with GDPR or in other areas.
I think that is a really great observation, this idea about setting your threshold at a certain level. And I think it may even be something that started right at the beginning with the comment that we had about, well, how much do you want to comply? I did a banking case once where I remember I looked up a certain rule in relation to the handling of checks, and it said a bank must do everything that is required under the regulations and no more. And it's not that you must do no more, it's you don't have to do any more than that. That's it, that's all you have to do. And if you think about it, if banking decided to conduct a due diligence on every single transaction, it would become very expensive. It would be like going through airport security every time you want to bank a check, just because we're worried that it's the subject of some money laundering, or it's got a backstory that's to do with tax evasion. And so then this question arises, which is a very, very good one, which is you need to work out to what level you're going to actually pitch your level of compliance and transparency so that it's commercially viable and it's commercially appropriate. And that's something that we're all going to be much more conscious of as we automate things. So I think it's a brilliant observation to actually say, well, it's not always at the same level. And yes, that can be about intent, it can be about expectation, and it could also be about the triple bottom line and wanting to actually meet something more than just a commercial outcome for your shareholders, but you want to do something that's also good for the environment and sustainable for your own business, but also for your physical world, the built world that we're in and the natural world. So I don't know how we got there, but we seem to have come up with the most incredibly all-encompassing set of sort of elements that obviously need to be automated. But I think what's really interesting, and I'd be happy to get any final comments as we just go around and wrap up, about this idea that when we automate things, we suddenly make explicit all the stuff that used to be so incredibly innate, or we knew inherently and quietly in our own way, thinking about the fence paradox, but now what we want to do is actually make it explicit, make it programmable, and make it discoverable and then defensible. So does anybody want to talk about this transition from human control of governance to the automation of governance and how different that is?
Is it actually
Completely ditch my brilliant question.
Is it actually not human control if we set up the system?
I guess what we're talking about is okay, so that's a really good point. So you've got the human control over the system, and maybe what that means is that governance ultimately is about a human expression of control of whatever the system is, and that's where the accountability lies. Accountability must lie with the governance that says, and if it fails, this is the human or the entity with personhood that will be liable and responsible. Maybe that's right. Does anybody else think that when we talk about blockchain and its automation of trust, that all that governance could then be baked into an automated system?
I think it's really interesting when we come to the idea of explicit or implicit, because it's quite difficult to actually translate what we think of as implicit and make that explicit. And that's one of the problems we have when we're trying to create these systems is it is so implicit, it is so inherent in the way that we just do things and expect things to operate that we don't even realize that we're doing things. We don't even realize that we're taking certain actions. And being able to take that, being able to actually put that into a system requires us to first identify what it is. And that's really, really difficult. And that's one of the problems we have building these systems is we have trouble identifying that. And in order to do that identification process, it cannot just be the person who is building the thing, because everyone sees it through their own paradigm. And you cannot just have a developer building a solution for law or building a solution for the building industry. You need the builders, you need the engineers, you possibly do need the lawyers, you need the regulator, you need everyone who is involved in this to be able to work out, because each of them will have something else that they think is inherent, that they think or they know has to be in there. But until they actually have input and consider the system, they don't even know that they're thinking in that way, that it could be made explicit. And even once it is, again, as I was saying before, things change, times change, policies change, expectations change, and yes, I'm using that word again.
So is there
And it has to be
governance
there.
around the quality piece to your point? You know, is there a new governance regime? Like a building, you have a building code. With the system, do you have a technology code? Is there a new governance regime?
Perhaps that does need to be part of it.
I mean, if we take,
Ah!
or even if we,
I think it is the standards, just even harking back to the conversation about the algorithms and the expectation of what comes out of them and the analysis of the data or the putting of the data into them. Is that the right data to be used and all the rest of it? Talking about, you know, parameters controlling what comes out of the algorithms and standards to what goes into them and how they're programmed to operate.
And interoperate. Standards support interoperability as well.
I was thinking with smart contract audits, you have not only sort of the low-level technical audit where you're checking for certain error conditions that are possible, but you're also thinking of human engineering attacks. You're thinking, like as a sort of senior engineer, you are looking beyond just the code. But I wanted to draw a bit of a parallel with maybe how code is developed in the open source way, where you might have multiple contributors to the same body of code, and they're each developing perhaps different sections, perhaps overlapping at different times, contributing to the same code. But is that not how perhaps law has evolved over time? But coding maybe runs a lot quicker. So in the same way that we could have unintended consequences in this complexity of a program, could we have been developing, have we developed a legal system that also might have sort of these, not only loopholes, which are maybe the short-term bugs that you can fix, but more of the unexpected consequences of a complex system? Not to critique.
No, I think there are instances over time where we have had to change the law because there were unintended consequences. For many, many years, insider trading was not actually illegal. And until we're able to, until there was a law that was brought in saying that this is not conduct you should be engaging in, well, it was rampant, because if your role is as a trader, well, then that makes sense. Why wouldn't you take advantage of that
I'd consider
information?
that more so a small near-term one, whereas something that might compound itself over multiple rules, bouncing between different regulations, perhaps creating a system that is not so great. So could we look at how we're not considering the environment maybe until we explicitly add it to the code? It's something that maybe capitalism generally or profit, focusing on shareholder investments has allowed us to sort of circumvent with a whole lot of rules and regulation along the way. But only now we look at that, oh, actually, that's not so great. We've got this massive flywheel spinning very quickly that's not factoring this in. What do we do now? Like, I'm not saying we need to reset the code, but those things that happen in tech can happen.
Speaking from a strictly commercial point of view, I always know that capitalism was based on the whole concept of trust but verify. And that seems to me is to what you're going to have to do in this new brave blockchain world.
So can I wrap that up on that point and just say, I think what we have come to that has really changed for everybody over the last couple of decades is that I think we all appreciate that if you look at capitalism and the market driving the way the decisions are made, one of the things I think we've all accepted is that if you are very, very successful, you may be actually excluding others from the market in the way that you're operating. It's not necessarily always inclusive. And I think we've all started to think about sustainability because we know that if you don't operate in a way that's sustainable, there is a possibility that you create human insecurity for others around the world, and vulnerable populations lead to insecurity for us. We all have to share in investing in human sustainability because it delivers human security for everyone. If you don't have sufficient resources, it creates conflict. And to share resources and to share wealth and access to finance brings us back really to how the first presentation began yesterday at the start of this festival, which was a very aspirational approach to saying tech can also deliver solutions to those who may have access to a mobile phone but don't have a bank account and can't register the property they have and borrow against it. And I think when we think about technologies and this triple bottom line and the way this conversation's gone with governance, that culture can also then have a knock-on effect and create benefits for those outside of the immediate ecosystem of your platform that you're trying to generate. So I know that's really aspirational, but do you think that that's a note upon which we could all say that we're happy to conclude when we're talking about good culture for governance and including for humans and also for autonomous systems? So I think I'm getting lots of nods, probably the first time in the whole symposium. So it would be really politic to stop now. But thank you for sharing. We hope everybody's listened and uses this as a resource in the future, and come back in 10 years, watch it again and see how we're tracking. Anyway, thank you.